The summer of 1877 had scoured the Dakota Territory down to its bones. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating the prairie into a brittle, dun-colored sheet that cracked under a horse's hoof. The wind, when it stirred, offered no relief, carrying only the alkaline bite of dust and the salt sweat tang of exhausted animals. For weeks, the sky had remained a vast, empty bowl of searing blue, promising nothing. Chaska watched it all from the scant shade of a stunted cottonwood. At 30-some years, he was a man carved from the land itself, all hard lines and weathered patience. His face was a map of his life, a life lived between the fading world of the Lakota and the noisy, grasping world of the mining town they called Ash Hollow. He wore the white man's canvas trousers and a worn-out shirt, but his hair was long and braided, and the knife on his hip was balanced with the easy familiarity of a limb. His eyes, the color of wet stone, missed nothing. They saw the heat shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon, saw the way a lone hawk circled on a thermal, too tired to hunt with any real purpose. They saw the faint plume of dust to the east long before a man less accustomed to this emptiness would have noticed. It was not the lumbering cloud of a cattle drive or the tidy signature of the weekly mail coach. This was the frantic, uneven dust of a hard pursuit. He shifted, his weight moving with the fluid silence of a predator. His horse, a sturdy buckskin that had carried him through more than one fight, flicked an ear but did not stir. Chaska's hand rested on its neck, a gesture of both command and reassurance. He narrowed his eyes, and the distant cloud resolved into 4 figures, 3 riders, low in the saddle, pushing their mounts with a cruel urgency, and one ahead of them, smaller, lighter, her horse laboring, a woman. He had no stake in the squabbles of the *Wasichu*. The settlers, their thirst for gold, for land, for water, was a fever that had infected the plains, and he wanted only to keep his people clear of its delirium. But there was something in the desperate line of the woman's back, the way she clung to her horse. That snagged his attention. It wasn't the posture of a fleeing criminal. It was the terror of prey. Elise Hartman tasted blood and dust. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath, and the muscles in her thighs screamed in protest. Her horse, a fine bay named Gabriel that had belonged to her late husband, was flagging. His breath came in great, shuddering gasps, his coat dark with sweat. She urged him on, her voice a raw whisper. "Just a little more? Gabe, just to the ridge." But the ridge offered no sanctuary. Beyond it lay more of the same, an endless, sun-blasted expanse. The 3 men behind her were gaining. She didn't have to look back to know it. She could feel their presence like a physical pressure, a hot breath on her neck. She knew their faces. They were Sheriff Bram Kellard's men, though they wore no badges today. Men who frequented the saloons of Ash Hollow. Their laughter always a little too loud, their eyes always a little too sharp. They worked for Silas Crowell, the man whose mining company was sucking the life from Willow Creek and the town that depended on it. And they wanted the cowhide ledger strapped to her saddle. The ledger was all she had left of Martin. It was his last work, a meticulous survey of the water tables and tributaries feeding the lands that bordered Crowell's claim lands that were supposed to be protected Lakota territory by treaty. After Martin's surveying equipment had accidentally failed, sending him plunging into Raven's Gorge, the ledger was the only thing the sheriff's office had returned to her. They'd called his death a tragedy. Elise called it murder. A shot rang out. Not the sharp crack of a rifle, but the dull boom of a pistol fired from a moving horse. The bullet whined past her ear, close enough to make her flinch violently. It wasn't a warning. It was a miss born of haste. They weren't trying to capture her. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Gabriel stumbled, his front leg buckling for a terrifying second. He recovered, but his stride was broken. They were going to run him to death, and her with him. Tears of rage and fear stung her eyes, drying instantly in the hot wind. She had been so careful. leaving Ash Hollow before dawn, telling no one where she was going. She had meant to take the ledger to the federal marshal in Fort Laramie, to show anyone the truth she was certain lay within its pages. But they had been waiting. Chaska urged his horse forward, not into the open, but along a shallow ravine that ran parallel to the dirt track. He moved without haste, his actions economical and precise. He was not a fool to charge 3 armed men for a woman he did not know, but he recognized the riders. One was a burly man named Cobb, a hired gun who did Crowell's dirtiest work. The others were of the same stock. Their intent was as clear as the merciless sky. He saw the woman's horse falter and knew her time was measured in heartbeats. And then he heard a familiar, rhythmic clatter and jingle from the west. The mail coach. It was early, its driver pushing the team hard to make up for time lost to a lame horse at the last way station. It was a chance, a slim one. He broke from the cover of the ravine at a gallop, not towards the woman, but on an angle that would intercept her path just as the coach drew near. His sudden appearance startled her pursuers. For a moment, they reined in, confused by this lone Lakota rider who seemed to have materialized from the baked earth itself. That moment was all he needed. He drew alongside Elise, his face impassive. "The coach," he yelled, his voice rough but clear over the pounding of hooves. "Get on it." Elise stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. An Indian. He wasn't threatening her, but he wasn't offering a gentle rescue either. His expression was one of grim necessity. "They'll kill you," she shouted back, her gaze flicking to the men who were now spurring their horses forward again, their surprise turning to anger. "They'll kill you first," Chaska said, the words clipped. "Ride." He didn't wait for her agreement. He leaned from his saddle, grabbed Gabriel's reins, and pulled the exhausted horse into a final, desperate burst of speed. He steered them directly into the path of the oncoming coach. The driver, a grizzled man with a face like a road map, yelled a curse, hauling back on the reins. The team of 4 horses whinnied and stamped, the heavy coach lurching as the brakes screamed. Chaska used the chaos. As the coach skidded past them in a cloud of its own dust, he pulled his knife. With a single, fluid motion, he sliced through the leather straps holding the ledger to Elise's saddle. He shoved the stiff cowhide portfolio into her arms. "Go," he commanded, slapping Gabriel's rump hard. The startled horse lunged toward the slowing coach. A shotgun rider leaned out from beside the driver, his weapon leveled. "What in blazes is this?" he roared. "She needs passage," Chaska yelled, already wheeling his buckskin around to face the 3 riders. Trouble behind her. Cobb and his men were closing in. They saw their prize being handed off, and their expressions hardened into murderous resolve. Chaska didn't draw his rifle. That would be suicide. Instead, he charged directly at them, whooping a Lakota war cry that was less about courage and more about pure, calculated disruption. He fired a single shot from his revolver into the dirt in front of the lead horse, sending it rearing in panic. The 3 men were forced to break apart, fighting their own mounts. It was enough. Elise, acting on pure instinct, scrambled from her saddle and practically threw herself at the coach door. The shotgun rider, seeing the armed men and understanding the universal language of a life in peril, holstered his weapon and hauled her inside. The driver cracked his whip, and the coach jolted forward, leaving Gabriel, reins trailing, to wander free. Chaska didn't linger to watch. He cut a hard right, disappearing back into the labyrinth of gullies and ravines that only he knew, the shouts and curses of Crowell's men fading behind him. He had not saved the woman. He had merely bought her a few hours, and in doing so, had tied his fate to hers, a knot pulled tight by shared dust and sudden violence. Inside the coach, Elise was thrown against the opposite seat as the vehicle careened down the track. She was alone in the passenger compartment, which smelled of sweat, old leather, and mailbags. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. She clutched the cowhide ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. Her breath came in ragged sobs of relief and terror. The face of the Lakota man burned in her mind, the stark plains of his cheeks, the unreadable calm in his dark eyes, the sheer, brutal efficiency of his actions. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't offered his. He had simply acted. A force of nature as sudden and decisive as a lightning strike. An hour later, the coach slowed as it forded a pitifully shallow creek. The driver called a halt to water the horses from a barrel. Elise pushed open the door, her legs unsteady, and stumbled out into the oppressive heat. The shotgun rider, a young man named Billy, gave her a wary but not unkind look. "You all right, ma'am?" "I will be," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank that Indian. Never seen anything like it." She looked back down the road, but there was nothing to see but the endless, shimmering horizon. She found a spot of shade by a wilting willow and finally opened the ledger. Her hands trembled. She had looked through it a dozen times, but always with the loving, slightly blind eyes of a grieving wife. She had seen Martin's familiar, precise handwriting, the elegant lines of his cartography, and had assumed the truth was plain on the page. Now, with the metallic taste of fear still in her mouth, she looked again. She saw it differently. The survey focused on the Split Rock Canyon, the only reliable water source for miles. The maps detailed underground aquifers and seasonal streams that fed the reservation lands, the very lands Silas Crowell was trying to declare arid and unused, so he could seize them for his mining operations. Martin's notes seemed to support this, but as she traced the lines, a cold dread began to seep into her bones. A stream she knew ran year-round was marked as seasonal. A spring cherished by the Lakota was not marked at all. The rainfall measurements, recorded meticulously in the margins, were for the driest years on record, presented as the average. It was a lie, a beautiful, expertly crafted lie, all dressed up in the language of science and law. Tears welled in her eyes. This wasn't Martin's work. He was too honest, too meticulous. He had loved this land, its stark beauty and its hidden life. He would never have... Her thumb brushed against the official seal of the Dakota Territorial Survey Office at the bottom of the title page, and she felt it, a faint, greasy smudge blurring the edge of the embossed paper. It was a thumbprint, pressed into the ink of the judge's signature stamp. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice. She knew that print. She had seen it 1,000 times on legal documents, on the family Bible, on the rim of a whiskey glass, the slight whorl, the tiny scar near the cuticle. It belonged to her father-in-law, Judge Otto Hartman. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Otto, who had welcomed her into his family with such warmth. Otto, who had delivered a moving eulogy at Martin's funeral, praising his son's integrity. Otto, who sat on the board of Silas Crowell's mining company. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. The ledger wasn't Martin's proof. It was his death warrant. He must have discovered the fraud his own father was perpetrating. He must have confronted him, and Crowell and his father-in-law had silenced him, taking his work and twisting it into a weapon to be used against the very people Martin had sought to protect. The men chasing her weren't just trying to retrieve a book. They were trying to bury the last witness. She felt a presence and looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the Lakota man. He had circled around and caught up with the coach, his horse now drinking greedily from the creek. He moved with no sound, his moccasins making no purchase on the dry, cracked earth. He walked over, his eyes landing on the open ledger in her lap. He didn't speak, but his gaze was a question, driven by an impulse she didn't understand. A desperate need to make one person in this God-forsaken land understand the truth. She held it out to him. "Look," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's a lie." Chaska took the ledger. He handled it with care, a surprising gentleness in his calloused hands. He couldn't read the white man's words, but he could read the land. He spent long minutes studying Martin's maps, his finger tracing the lines of rivers that were not there, of springs that were misplaced. A deep, cold anger settled in his gut. It was an old anger, one he knew well. It was the anger of watching his world be erased, not just with bullets and broken treaties, but with ink and paper. They use this to say the land is worthless, he said, his voice a low rumble. To say the water is not there, so they can take it. Yes, Elise breathed. And they killed my husband for it. She pointed a shaking finger at the thumbprint. And his own father helped them. Chaska looked from the ledger to her face, seeing the raw shock of betrayal there. He handed the book back to her. The shared knowledge created a fragile, unspoken bond between them. They were no longer just a Lakota warrior and a white woman. They were two people who possessed a truth so dangerous it had already cost one life and was actively hunting another. The coach driver shouted that it was time to move. Elise looked at Chaska, her mind racing. Where will you go? The hills. They will be looking for me now. They'll find you. They won't stop. She clutched the ledger. We can't just run. Hiding won't make this right. A new steely resolve was hardening over her grief. The men who had murdered her husband and corrupted his legacy would not win. Her father-in-law, the pillar of justice, would not hide behind his black robes. What then? Chaska asked, his gaze skeptical. You think the law in Ash Hollow will help you? The law is whatever Silas Crowell pays for? Maybe, she conceded. But there are other people in that town. People who are being hurt by Crowell. People who might listen. She thought of Dr. Bellamy, the town physician who treated everyone, settler and Lakota alike, with the same brusque fairness. She thought of Hazel Price, the young school teacher who was helping homesteaders file their claims properly. They were small points of light in a growing darkness. Running is what they want us to do. It makes us easy to pick off, one by one. In town. There are eyes everywhere. Chaska considered her words. She was right. In the open prairie, they were exposed. In the warren of Ash Hollow, a town built on greed and secrets. There was a different kind of danger, but also a different kind of cover. And there was a fight to be had. This ledger was not just her justice. It was a tool to protect his people's land, their water, their survival. To run from that fight was not in his nature. He gave a short, decisive nod. I will ride with the coach, but I will not ride in it. He swung himself onto his buckskin. As the mail coach began to roll forward, picking up speed, he kept pace, a silent, solitary guardian riding just beyond the cloud of red dust it kicked up. Elise watched him from the window, the cowhide ledger heavy in her lap. The dust was so thick it was like a curtain, obscuring the past and blurring the future. They were heading into the heart of the conspiracy, armed with nothing but a book of lies and a truth no one wanted to hear. The town of Ash Hollow announced itself not with a welcome sign, but with a sound, a relentless, rhythmic thunder that vibrated through the soles of your feet. It was the sound of the ore-stamping mill, the five-headed beast of iron and steam that was the town's heart, its god, and its jailer, day and night. It pounded rock into dust, a constant reminder of the single purpose that had clawed this settlement out of the prairie Silas Crowell's silver. As the mail coach rattled down the main street, a wide, rutted artery choked with fine gray dust Chaska had already melted away. He slipped from his horse a quarter-mile out, disappearing into the maze of scrub and rock that bordered Willow Creek, a ghost in the hazy afternoon light. He would watch. He would wait. The town was a trap, and he preferred to see the jaws before he walked into them. Elise, clutching the cowhide ledger, stepped out of the coach and into the noise. The air was thick with smoke from the engine, the sour tang of the saloons, and the grit that coated everything, finding its way into your eyes, your mouth, your soul. Men in sweat-stiffened clothes stopped to stare at her, their faces pale with mine dust. She was the surveyor's widow, a figure of tragedy. Today, she felt like a target. Ignoring the stares, she walked with a determined stride past the Gold Nugget Saloon, past the new clapboard front of Hartman and Crowell mining acquisitions, and did not stop until she reached a small, neat building with a single shingle swinging above the door * Dr. Ada Bellamy, physician *. The air inside was cool and smelled of carbolic soap and dried herbs. It was a sanctuary of order. Dr. Ada Bellamy, a woman whose face was a testament to 60 years of hard-won wisdom, was meticulously cleaning surgical instruments, her hands steady and sure. She looked up as Elise entered, her sharp blue eyes taking in the younger woman's disheveled state in a single, comprehensive glance. "Elise," she said, her voice calm and low. "You look like you've been wrestling with the devil himself. Sit down before you fall down." The dam of Elise's composure broke. Words tumbled out of her the chase. The Lakota man, the lies in the ledger, the horrifying discovery of her father-in-law's thumbprint. She laid the heavy book on Ada's examination table, its cover seeming to absorb the quiet of the room. Ada listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Elise finished, her voice a raw whisper. The doctor wiped her hands on a clean cloth and picked up the ledger. She didn't have Chaska's knowledge of the land, but she had spent 3 decades reading people. She studied the forged entries, the skewed data, the damning smudge of ink by the seal. "I've seen Otto Hartman's signature on 100 documents," Ada said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "And I've seen Silas Crowell's greed poison this town from the roots up. I believe every word you've said." She closed the book. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Elise could answer, the bell above the door chimed. Deputy Jonah Pike stepped inside, his hat in his hands. He was young, with a face that hadn't yet been hardened by the Dakota sun, and his eyes held a look of genuine concern. "Mrs. Hartman, Elise, we heard the coach was shot at. Are you unharmed?" he asked, his gaze soft. "I'm safe. Jonah, thank you," Elise said, her body tensing. She instinctively moved to stand between him and the ledger. "That's a relief," he said, though his eyes darted around the room, a flicker of unease in them. "The sheriff is very concerned. He's sent men out to search for the culprits." He hesitated, shifting his weight. "He also sent me with this. It's a warrant." He unrolled a piece of paper for the arrest of 1 unknown native male. The coach driver said he accosted you, brandished a weapon, and stole a firearm from one of Mr. Cobb's party who was riding to your aid. The lie was so audacious it left Elise breathless. "Stole a firearm. He saved my life." "I'm just delivering the message." "Ma'am," Jonah said, his gaze dropping to the floor. He looked genuinely troubled. "Sheriff Kellard insists. He says the man is a danger to the community." He looked up again, his voice dropping. "Be careful, Elise. Things in this town, they're not always what they seem." He tipped his hat and was gone, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. "A danger to Crowell's profits. He means," Ada muttered, her lips a thin, white line. The injustice of it seemed to solidify a decision in her. She walked to a heavy oak cabinet, unlocked it, and pulled out a slim manila folder. "Silas Crowell owns the sheriff. He owns the judge, and he thinks he owns me," she said, her voice like flint. She opened the folder on the table next to Martin's ledger. Inside was a coroner's report for 3 miners who had died in a shaft collapse the previous spring. The official cause was listed as seismic instability. Ada's signature was at the bottom. "This is a lie," Ada confessed, her face etched with a shame that was years old. "I was down in that mine an hour after it happened. The support timbers were green wood, half the required thickness. Crowell cut corners to save a few dollars, and it cost those men their lives. They were good men. One of them had a wife who was expecting their first child." She tapped a second, folded document in the file. "This is my original report, the one I wrote before Crowell came to my home. late at night. He didn't threaten me with violence. He was smarter than that. He threatened my medical supplies, my license, my ability to treat the very people he was putting in harm's way. He said I could sign his version, or I could watch the next woman die in childbirth because I couldn't get chloroform, so I signed. Elise stared at the copied report, at the two starkly different truths laid out on the table. A copy. The word echoed in her mind. Ada had kept a copy as a shield, or perhaps as a salve for her conscience. And suddenly, a memory flared in Elise's mind, sharp and clear. A conversation with Martin, just days before he died. He had been agitated, pacing their small living room. Asterisk, they're not listening. Elise. Asterisk, he'd said. Asterisk. They think I'm a fool, but I'm making an insurance policy. A copy. Something they can't touch. Asterisk. She had asked him where he would hide something so important. He had smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Asterisk, where a lie can't stand for long. Asterisk, he'd answered cryptically. Asterisk, a place built on truth, on numbers and stress and honest measure. Asterisk. He had been working on the structural survey of the old wooden trestle bridge spanning Raven's Gorge, the place where he died. Ada, Elise said, her voice electric with discovery. He made a copy. Martin, he made a copy of his real survey, the true one, and I think I know where he hid it. They needed help. Not just muscle, but a mind that understood the town's layout, its secrets. Ada's first thought was Hazel Price. The school teacher was more than just an educator. In a town where many couldn't read or write, she was the unofficial keeper of records, the quiet chronicler of homestead claims and property lines. Her small schoolhouse, sitting at the edge of town near the modest wooden church, was an island of meticulous order. They found her grading papers by the light of a kerosene lamp. Hazel, with her neatly pinned brown hair and intelligent, steady eyes, listened to the story with the focused attention of a scholar. She asked sharp, practical questions, her mind mapping the problem as if it were a complex equation. When they told her about the hidden ledger at the bridge, her brow furrowed. The gorge is watched, she said, standing and walking to a large, hand-drawn map of the county pinned to the wall. Crowell's men patrol the main road to the bridge. He claims it's to protect his equipment, but he's protecting his secrets. Her finger traced a faint, almost invisible line on the map. But there's another way. The old irrigation ditch. It was dug 20 years ago by the first settlers and abandoned when the creek level dropped. It runs from the bluffs behind the church, through the scrubland, and comes out right at the base of the gorge, well below the sight line of the road. It will be rough going, but you won't be seen. The plan began to form, a desperate, fragile thing held together by the courage of 3 women. From a ridge overlooking Ash Hollow, Chaska watched the town's rhythms. He saw the shift change at the mine, the exhausted men pouring out, the fresh men pouring in. He saw Deputy Pike nail the warrant for his arrest to the board outside the sheriff's office. A short while later, he saw Cobb and another of Crowell's men nail a crude, freshly painted sign to the door of the Gold Nugget Saloon, "No Indians Allowed." A cold, familiar weight settled in his chest. He had stepped into the white man's fight to help one person, and in doing so, had become a target, a justification for their hatred. He was torn. His instinct was to return to his people, to warn them of the coming land grab the ledger foretold. But leaving meant abandoning the woman and the truth to the wolves. It felt like a betrayal of the honor that had compelled him to act in the first place. He was protecting an outsider, yet in her fight for justice lay the protection of his own world. This paradox was the fence line he was now forced to walk. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, the stamping mill let out a great sigh of steam and fell silent. The abrupt quiet was more jarring than the noise had been. It was the signal. Elise, dressed in a dark traveling skirt and Martin's sturdy boots, met Chaska at the appointed spot behind the church. Hazel had given her a small parcel of food and a canteen. Ada had pressed a small, heavy derringer into her hand. "I hope to God you don't have to use this," the doctor had said. "But I'd rather you had it and didn't need it than needed it and didn't have it." Chaska simply nodded at her, his expression giving nothing away. He took the lead, moving with a silent grace that made him seem a part of the deepening shadows. They found the opening of the old irrigation ditch, a shallow, weed-choked scar on the earth. It was barely wide enough for them to walk single file. The trench descended into a world of its own. The last light of day vanished, cut off by the high earthen walls. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp soil and decay. They moved in near total darkness, guided by Chaska's uncanny sense of direction and the faint starlight that filtered down. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on loose gravel and their own quiet breathing. The silence was a relief after the thunder of the mill, but it was a heavy, watchful silence, pregnant with unseen dangers. Elise's heart pounded. Every rustle of a bush, every skitter of a nocturnal animal, sent a jolt of fear through her. Yet, the sight of Chaska's steady silhouette in front of her was a comfort. He was her only guide in this literal and figurative darkness. She was putting her life, her husband's legacy, everything, in the hands of a man she had met only that morning, a man his own town had just branded a criminal. After what felt like an eternity, the walls of the ditch began to lower. Ahead, Elise could see the stark, geometric silhouette of the trestle bridge against the star-dusted sky. Raven's Gorge. They were almost there. They climbed out of the ditch into a clearing of stunted pines at the foot of the gorge. The bridge loomed above them, a skeleton of timber and iron. Chaska suddenly stopped. He held up a hand, and Elise froze, her breath catching in her throat. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked, listening to something she couldn't hear. He was listening to the silence, and he had heard a flaw in it. A spark flared on the ridge above them, a tiny pinpoint of orange light the end of a cheroot. Then, the night was split apart by the deafening crack of a rifle. A chip of granite exploded from a rock just inches from Elise's head, stinging her cheek with sharp fragments. She cried out and stumbled back, her hand flying to her face. Chaska reacted instantly. He grabbed her arm and hauled her down behind a cluster of boulders, his body shielding hers. "Stay down," he hissed. Another shot rang out, thudding into the dirt where they had just been standing. They were pinned. The journey to the truth had led them straight into a trap. The rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the sharp, angry buzz of the bullet. Chaska didn't hesitate. He shoved Elise toward the dark maw of the irrigation ditch they had just left. Back now. They scrambled into the trench as another shot splintered the wood of a pine tree above them. Pinned down, but at least not exposed. The shooter on the ridge was patient, firing periodically to keep their heads down. "They knew," Elise whispered, her voice tight with terror. "This was a trap." "They knew someone was coming," Chaska corrected, his voice a low growl. His eyes scanned the lip of the ditch, the surrounding rocks, assessing every shadow. They didn't know who. He was calculating. The shooter was alone. Otherwise, they would have been flanked by now. He was conserving ammunition, which meant he was confident of his position. "We can't stay here until dawn," Chaska said. He pulled the derringer from Elise's trembling hand. It was a toy, a woman's weapon, but it would make noise. "When I tell you, run. Follow the ditch back the way we came. Don't stop." "What about you?" He gave her a look that silenced any further questions. He crawled 20 yards down the ditch, then aimed the small pistol into the air and fired twice in quick succession. The small pops were pathetic compared to the rifle's roar, but they were enough. As the sniper's attention was drawn to the sound, Chaska broke from the ditch on the opposite side, a fleeting shadow against the starlight, and sprinted into a thicket of scrub oak. Elise did as she was told. She ran, her lungs burning, her feet stumbling on the uneven ground of the ditch. She didn't dare look back. She could only pray that the man who had twice saved her life would have the cunning to save his own. The sniper, realizing the ruse, fired a shot in Chaska's direction, but it was a blind shot into the darkness. Chaska was already gone, circling through the rocks, a phantom moving on silent feet. He didn't engage. His purpose was not to fight, but to draw the fire, to split the threat. He let out a sharp, piercing cry that mimicked a nighthawk, a signal that he was clear. Then he vanished into the hills, planning to intercept Elise further down the line. When Elise finally stumbled out of the ditch near the church, she was alone. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Just as a desperate sob began to build in her chest, he emerged from the darkness beside her. As silent as the grave, he had retrieved their horses, without a word. They mounted and rode, not towards the treacherous safety of the town, but out onto the open prairie. They needed to disappear. Nature, however, had its own violent agenda. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that grew into a ravenous howl. It came from the south, hot and gritty, carrying a wall of dust so thick it blotted out the stars. The world was reduced to a suffocating, blinding chaos of swirling red dirt. The horses whinnied in terror, turning their backs to the onslaught. They could barely breathe, could see nothing. Chaska grabbed Elise's reins, keeping them together as the storm tried to tear them apart. And then the temperature plummeted. The hot wind became a frigid gale, and the dust turned to something hard and sharp. Hail, first the size of peas, then acorns, then walnuts, hammering down with a percussive fury that bruised skin and battered the senses. It was a storm of biblical rage, unseasonal and utterly merciless. Their horses, panicked and hurting, were nearly uncontrollable. Hypothermia was now a more immediate threat than any gunman. Through the maelstrom, Chaska spotted a dark, sagging shape against the gray tumult, the ghost of a building, an abandoned stable or line shack. There, he yelled over the roar. They half rode, half dragged their terrified horses toward it, the hail striking them with the force of thrown stones. The stable was a wreck, half its roof missing, but one corner offered a pocket of shelter from the wind and the worst of the ice. They huddled inside, shivering uncontrollably, their clothes soaked and their bodies aching. Chaska worked quickly, stripping the saddles from the horses and rubbing them down with saddle blankets to keep them from freezing, his movements efficient despite his chattering teeth. They were trapped, marooned in a sea of ice and wind. The cold was a physical entity, leeching the life from them. Elise's teeth chattered so violently she thought they would break. Chaska, seeing her state, pulled her close, wrapping his own blanket around her shoulders. The contact was not intimate, but essential, a shared huddling for warmth like two creatures of the wild surviving a blizzard. "They say," Chaska said, his voice low and rough, breaking the long silence, "that a storm like this washes the world clean." Elise looked at his face, illuminated by a brief flash of lightning. She saw the exhaustion, the tension in his jaw, and she saw the old anger in his eyes, a fire banked but not extinguished. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked, the question surprising her own ears. He was quiet for a moment. "I see a woman fighting for a dead man's honor," he said, "and I see the family of the men who hunt my own people." The words were not an accusation, just a statement of fact, as stark and unyielding as the landscape outside. "My husband was not like them," she said fiercely. "No," Chaska agreed. "He was not. That was all he said, but it was enough." In the forced intimacy of the storm, Elise felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. This man, this savage the sheriff wanted to hang, was now the only thing keeping her alive. She was acutely aware of the strength in the arm around her, the steady beat of his heart against her back, and it terrified her. A new fear, entirely different from the fear of Kellard's guns, bloomed in her chest. She was afraid of the warmth spreading through her, the sense of safety she felt in his presence. She was afraid of her own heart, which was betraying the memory of her husband with every beat. Back in Ash Hollow, Ada and Hazel were waging a different kind of war. While the storm raged outside, they moved through the town, their lanterns casting defiant circles of light. They went first to the small cluster of sod houses where the German immigrant families lived. They spoke to the Mullers, whose small barley crop had withered and died when Willow Creek slowed to a muddy trickle, diverted by Crowell's preliminary dam work upriver. At first, the family was terrified, shaking their heads and refusing to speak against the man who owned the town. But Ada was relentless, and Hazel, speaking to them in their own language, laid out the facts with systematic clarity. She showed them on a map how Crowell's diversion was not just illegal, but a calculated act of strangulation. "He doesn't want your land," Hazel explained, her voice firm but kind. "He wants your desperation. He wants you to sell it to him for pennies on the dollar." By morning, when the storm had passed, leaving a bizarre landscape of ice-coated dust, they had 3 signed affidavits. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Their hope came in the form of a mud-splattered buggy that rolled into town late that afternoon. Circuit Judge Lawrence Morrison had arrived, a man known for his rigid adherence to the letter of the law and his profound dislike for the kind of frontier corruption that festered in towns like Ash Hollow. Ada and Hazel cornered him in the hotel lobby, presenting their affidavits and a formal petition for a provisional hearing on the illegal diversion of water and the intimidation of local landowners. Morrison, a stern man with a face like a hawk, read their petition, his eyes missing nothing. He looked at the evidence, then at the 2 determined women before him. "This hearing is highly irregular," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "but the allegations are profoundly serious. Very well. I will convene a hearing tomorrow morning in the saloon. It's the only building large enough. Be ready." Crowell and Kellard moved swiftly to counter. They had their own expert, a slick surveyor from Denver named Finch, who arrived on the evening train. He came armed with charts and logarithmic tables, ready to drown justice in a flood of fabricated data. The next morning, the Gold Nugget Saloon was packed. The air, usually thick with tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey, was electric with tension. Judge Morrison sat at a makeshift bench, his face grim. Elise and Chaska stood with Ada and Hazel. Chaska was a totem of stoicism in the hostile crowd, his presence drawing murmurs and glares. He was being forced to play the part they had written for him, the wild troublemaker, the source of all this conflict. He could feel the old rage coiling in his gut, the same rage he'd felt seeing his people's land surveyed, sectioned, and sold. Finch, Crowell's expert, spoke first. He unrolled maps showing seasonal rainfall patterns that were pure fiction, arguing that Crowell's reservoir was a necessary act of civic foresight in a drought-prone land. He spoke of the river as a resource to be tamed, its natural flow and inefficiency to be corrected by the hand of industry. The river, he argued, must be made to serve the needs of progress, not the superstitions of savages or the complaints of a few dirt-poor farmers. It was a vision of the law as a tool to bend nature and people to the will of the powerful. Then Ada took the stand. She presented the affidavits. She spoke of the intimidation. She spoke of Martin Hartman's integrity and his suspicious death. Her voice was steady, clear, and filled with the conviction of a woman who had decided that her silence was no longer for sale. The climax of the hearing rested on a single point: the attack at Raven's Gorge. If they could prove Elise was a witness under threat, Judge Morrison would have no choice but to grant her protection and launch a federal investigation. "I called Deputy Jonah Pike to the stand," Ada announced. A hush fell over the room. Jonah walked to the front, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He swore the oath, his voice barely a whisper. Ada's question was simple. "Deputy, you were the first officer to speak with Mrs. Hartman after her ordeal. Did she appear to be a woman who had been accosted by a dangerous native, or a woman fleeing for her life from armed assailants?" Jonah swallowed hard. He risked a glance at Sheriff Kellard, who stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold command. In that single, fleeting look, a universe of threat was conveyed. "Well, ma'am," Jonah began, his voice cracking. It was confusing. Mrs. Hartman was distressed, certainly, but the men pursuing her, Mr. Cobb and his associates, they stated they were merely riding to her aid after seeing a wanted man force her off her horse. A gasp went through the room. Elise felt the blood drain from her face. Ada pressed on, her voice sharp. "And the firearm the warrant claims was stolen." Jonah looked at his boots. "Mr. Cobb filed a report, said the Indian fired on them, and in the confusion, his sidearm went missing. We have no evidence to the contrary." It was over. The betrayal was absolute. A clean, sharp knife to the heart of their case. Jonah, the good, kind deputy, had chosen his master. Judge Morrison slammed his gavel. "This court has heard testimony, however conflicting. While the water rights issue warrants further review at the county seat, I see no grounds to issue a protective order based on hearsay and unsubstantiated fear. Petition denied. This hearing is adjourned." Chaos erupted. In the crush of bodies moving toward the doors, Elise felt a profound despair. They had lost. Crowell had won. As they stepped out of the saloon's gloom and into the harsh sunlight, it happened. Two of Kellard's men materialized from the crowd. They moved with a brutal efficiency. One of them slammed into Hazel, sending her sprawling, while the other lunged for the leather satchel in Elise's hands, the one containing both her husband's forged ledger and Ada's damning medical files. Elise clung to it, but the man was too strong. He ripped it from her grasp. Chaska moved like a striking snake. He shoved Elise behind him, shielding her, and in two swift movements, disabled the man closest to her with a crippling blow to the knee. But the other man, the one with the satchel, was already sprinting down the street, disappearing into an alleyway. For a split second, Chaska was faced with an impossible choice. He could pursue the man with the evidence, the paper proof that could save his people's land and bring Martin's killers to justice. Or he could stay and protect the woman who was now completely exposed, surrounded by Kellard's cronies, who were regrouping for another attack. He looked at Elise's terrified face, at the raw vulnerability in her eyes. The choice was never really a choice at all. He stood his ground, a bulwark between her and the snarling faces of Kellard's men. He let the evidence go. He watched their only proof vanish into the dusty streets of Ash Hollow, sacrificing the law of man to honor a more fundamental law, the instinct to protect a life. The air in Dr. Ada Bellamy's surgery was thick with the bitter taste of defeat. Outside, the town of Ash Hollow slowly returned to its routine, the saloon filling back up, the rhythmic thunder of the stamping mill resuming its beat, pounding their failure into the very bones of the earth. They had lost the evidence. They had been outmaneuvered, publicly discredited. Jonah Pike's betrayal had been the final, sharp twist of the knife. Hazel was tending to a scrape on her arm from the fall, her movements precise, but her face pale with shock. Ada stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching the street with the grim vigilance of a sentry on a losing battlefield. Elise felt a hollow emptiness that was colder and sharper than her grief had ever been. It was the feeling of utter hopelessness. Chaska was the only one who seemed unmoved. He stood near the door, a silent pillar of contained energy. He had not spoken since the confrontation, but his eyes were constantly moving, assessing, watching the town that had just declared him a criminal. "It's over," Elise finally said, her voice a dead thing. "They have the ledger. They'll burn it. We have nothing." "We have our word," Ada countered, her voice flinty. "And the affidavits, which Judge Morrison will file away in a dusty cabinet in the county seat and forget about by supper time," Hazel added, her usual optimism completely extinguished. "Without the ledger to prove the motive, they're just the complaints of a few poor farmers." A heavy silence descended again. It was in that silence that the memory, dormant and grief-shrouded, Return to Elise. A fragment of a conversation with Martin. A few nights before he died, his agitation, his frustration. Asterisk. A place built on truth, on numbers and stress and honest measure. It wasn't just a cryptic phrase, it was a location. "The bridge," Elise whispered, her head snapping up. The other three looked at her. "What about it?" Ada asked. "My husband," Elise said, her voice gaining strength, her eyes locking onto Chaska's. "He made a copy. He told me he was making an insurance policy. He said he hid it where a lie couldn't stand for long. A place built on honest measure." She stood up, the lethargy falling away from her like a shed skin. He was working on the structural survey for the Raven's Gorge trestle. He was there for days, measuring the stress loads, the timber integrity. He hid it asterisk in asterisk the bridge. A flicker of something not quite hope, but a sharp, dangerous interest appeared in Chaska's eyes. "It's the only chance we have left," Elise insisted, looking at each of them in turn. The asterisk, real asterisk ledger. The truth. In his own hand. The risks were enormous. Kellard and his men would have the gorge watched more closely than ever. Another attempt would be suicide. "We can't use the irrigation ditch again," Hazel said, her practical mind already working the problem. They'll be expecting that, and the main road is out of the question. She walked over to a framed geological survey map on Ada's wall, a relic from the town's first silver strike. Her finger traced the jagged lines of the canyons and bluffs. But there's a third way. An old prospector's tunnel. They called it the Widow's Crawl. My father told me about it. It was a failed silver vein, abandoned decades ago. The entrance is in the hills behind the old livery. It's supposed to come out on a ledge halfway down the gorge wall, not far from the north abutment of the bridge. "Supposed to?" Ada echoed, her eyebrows raised. "It's not on any official map," Hazel admitted. "And it's likely unstable, but it's the only way they won't see you coming." Her gaze was steady, her fear from the street now burned away by a cold resolve. She was no longer just the schoolteacher. She was one of them now, a conspirator. As they planned, Ada pulled Elise aside. Her face was etched with a deep, weary guilt. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice low. "My complicity with Crowell. It goes deeper than that one coroner's report." She took a deep breath. "Over the years, there have been accidents, fights at the mine that never made it into the sheriff's blotter. Men who got in Crowell's way, he would have them brought to me. In the middle of the night. Kellard would stand guard at the door. I'd patch them up, set their bones, and swear I never saw them. If I refused, he'd make sure my next shipment of laudanum or quinine was lost on the railway." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and sour. It was the truth of how a town rots from the inside out, not through grand acts of villainy, but through 1,000 small compromises made by good people who feel they have no other choice. It was a burden Ada had carried alone for years, and now, in this desperate hour, she was laying it at Elise's feet as both a warning and a plea for redemption. That night, under a sliver of moon, the four of them moved through the sleeping town like wraiths. Chaska led the way, his senses alive to every sound, every shadow. They reached the abandoned livery, its sagging roof a dark blot against the stars. Hazel, her map committed to memory, guided them into the hills behind it, to a place where a thicket of overgrown manzanita concealed a dark, narrow slit in the rock face, the entrance to the Widow's Crawl. The air that wafted out was cold and smelled of damp earth and utter stillness. "This is it," Hazel said, her voice a nervous whisper. "I'll go first with the lantern. Be careful of loose rock." The tunnel was a tight, claustrophobic passage. It twisted and turned, forcing them to stoop and sometimes crawl. The beams of their 2 lanterns threw dancing, monstrous shadows on the wet rock walls. Water dripped with a steady, maddening rhythm, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. It was a journey into the guts of the earth, a descent into a forgotten world. After what felt like hours, they felt a change in the air, a faint draft that carried the scent of pine and cold stone. The tunnel opened onto a narrow ledge, barely 3 feet wide, overlooking the immense, terrifying void of Raven's Gorge. The trestle bridge was 100 feet away, a delicate web of black timber spanning the chasm. Below, the river was a ribbon of churning white water, its roar a constant, low thunder. The wind was a living thing up here, plucking at their clothes, trying to unbalance them. They began to inch their way along the ledge toward the bridge's foundation. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A low, powerful boom echoed through the gorge. Not loud, but deep. A vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was the sound of a contained explosion. On the far side of the canyon, a cloud of dust billowed up from the plains. Chaska flattened himself against the rock wall, pulling Elise with him. "Get down." A few seconds later, a new sound joined the roar of the river, a sound of immense and terrifying power. It was the thunder of 1,000 hooves. On the plains above, a herd of longhorn cattle, spooked by the test blast, was stampeding. They poured over the edge of a nearby coulee, a river of horns and terrified flesh, their momentum carrying some of them over the cliff edge. The sight was surreal, a nightmare of falling bodies plunging into the darkness below. The main body of the herd veered away at the last second, thundering off into the night, but the danger had been terrifyingly real. A few more yards in either direction, and they would have been swept away. "A test," Chaska said, his voice grim as he looked toward the bridge. "They're setting charges." They had to move, and move now. They reached the massive stone abutment where the bridge was anchored to the cliffside. Getting onto the structure itself was a perilous climb. Chaska went first, finding handholds in the rough-hewn stone, then reaching down to haul the others up. They were on the bridge. The wind howled through the trestles, and with every gust, the entire structure seemed to groan and sway. They stayed low, using the massive support beams for cover as they made their way toward the center, where the stress on the structure and a surveyor's interest would be greatest. "It would be here," Elise said, her voice barely audible over the wind. She ran her hands over a massive crossbeam, her fingers searching for anything unusual, a place he could access, but no one else would ever notice. Chaska's keen eyes scanned the construction. He pointed to a spot where 2 massive timbers were joined by a large iron plate and bolt. "There! The bolt is newer than the others. The wood around it has been disturbed." It took their combined effort to work the massive nut loose with a wrench from Chaska's saddle roll. When the bolt was finally out, Chaska pried the iron plate away. Inside the beam was a hollowed-out cavity, and nestled within it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a second cowhide ledger. Elise's hands shook as she took it. She unwrapped the oilcloth, her heart pounding. She opened the cover. It was Martin's familiar, precise handwriting, the real survey, with accurate water tables, the locations of the sacred springs, and meticulous notes in the margins detailing the pressure he was under from Crowell and his own father. But there was something else. Tucked into a sleeve in the back cover was another map, drawn on finer paper. It was not a survey of water, but of the land itself, dotted with symbols Elise didn't recognize. Chaska took it from her, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized it instantly. It was a map of the asterisk Paha Sapa asterisk, the sacred Black Hills, and the symbols marked the locations of his people's burial sites, the secret, hallowed grounds where the bones of his ancestors rested. At the bottom, in Martin's hand, was a single, stark sentence asterisk. "This belongs to the people. It must be returned." The truth hit Elise with the force of a physical blow. Martin hadn't just been trying to expose a crime. He had been trying to atone for the sins of his people, his family. He was going to give this map back to the Lakota, a gesture of restitution, of profound respect. This second ledger was not just a legal document, it was a testament. It was her husband's soul. A flicker of light from the far end of the bridge. Sheriff Kellard, holding a lantern, stepped onto the tracks, flanked by two of his men, and beside them, his face a pale, ghostly mask in the lantern light, was Deputy Jonah Pike. "I knew you'd come," Kellard's voice boomed. "Carried on the wind, you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Mrs. Hartman." They were trapped in the middle of the bridge, 100 feet above a raging river. "It's over," Kellard Elise shouted, holding up the ledger. "We have the real proof." Kellard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Proof is a funny thing. It has a tendency to disappear." He raised the lantern in a signal. And then the world exploded. The charge Kellard's men had planted in the far support pillar detonated with a deafening roar. The bridge bucked and twisted like a dying animal. Timber splintered. Iron screamed. The entire section behind them gave way, plunging into the canyon in a cascade of wood and rock. They were stranded on a swaying, breaking island. The path back to the ledge gone. The section in front of them, leading to Kellard, was groaning, threatening to collapse at any second. There was no time to think. Chaska grabbed the ledger from Elise and shoved it inside his shirt. He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Hold on," he roared, and he ran. He ran across the groaning, splintering timbers, his feet sure and swift even as the bridge disintegrated beneath them. Wood cracked, planks fell away into the void. He leaped across a gaping hole, landing hard on the other side just as the section he'd left tore free. They made it to the solid ground of the far side, collapsing in a heap as the last of the bridge shuddered and fell silent. They were alive. They were on the same side as Kellard. Kellard raised his pistol, a triumphant sneer on his face. Nowhere left to run. Suddenly, another figure moved. Jonah Pike, who had been standing frozen, his face a mask of horror, drew his own revolver, but he didn't aim at Chaska or Elise. He aimed at the lantern in Kellard's hand. He fired. The shot went wide, deliberately so, shattering the rock just beside Kellard's head. It wasn't an attack. It was a diversion. The spray of rock chips made Kellard flinch and stumble back, his aim ruined for a critical second. In that second of confusion, Chaska was on his feet, dragging Elise into the darkness of the trees at the edge of the gorge. Kellard, cursing, fired 2 shots after them, but they were already gone, swallowed by the night. They ran until their lungs burned, finally collapsing in a ravine miles away. They had the ledger. They were alive. As Elise caught her breath, she looked at the oilcloth-wrapped truth in her hands. A thought, cold and stark, cut through her relief. "The dam," she said, looking at Chaska. "The main construction at Split Rock Canyon. Kellard said at the hearing it would be 3 more weeks. Chaska shook his head, his face grim in the moonlight. He was lying. "My people have been watching. The work has sped up. With the bridge gone, no one from the county seat can get here to inspect it." He met her eyes, and she saw the terrible urgency in his gaze. "They will close the main sluice gate and cut off the water for good in 3 days. The darkness that had swallowed them after their escape from Raven's Gorge was absolute. A cold, suffocating blanket. They moved for hours, guided only by the stars and Chaska's unerring sense of the land's contours. The adrenaline had long since burned away, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion that was as much of the soul as the body. Every step was an act of will, every breath a conscious effort. Just when Elise felt she could go no further, that she would simply slide from her horse and let the prairie take her, Chaska reined in. They were in a small, sheltered meadow, bisected by a gurgling stream that sounded impossibly loud in the profound silence. Tucked into a stand of old-growth pines was a small, dark shape, a cabin. It was an old hunter's line shack, long abandoned. The door hung on one leather hinge, and the single window was just a shuttered square. But the roof was mostly intact, and the stone chimney stood solid. It was a haven. Chaska dismounted and, with a quiet word, led the horses to the stream. While they drank, he gathered stones and built a small, smokeless fire in the cabin's hearth, his movements economical and certain. He found a bucket, rinsed it in the clean, cold water, and brought it inside. He did not speak, but his actions were a language of their own, a quiet declaration of sanctuary. He was creating a space where they could, for a few hours, cease to be hunted things. The fire caught, its small, hungry flames pushing back the damp chill and the oppressive darkness. It cast a warm, flickering light on the cabin's single room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, the rough-hewn timber walls, and the exhaustion carved into their faces. The smell of damp pine and wood smoke filled the small space, a scent of life and warmth. Outside, the stream murmured its endless song, and from far off in the hills, a lone wolf howled, its call a thin, silver thread of wildness in the vast tapestry of the night. Elise sank onto a rickety three-legged stool near the hearth, her body trembling with a fatigue so deep it felt like an illness. Chaska handed her a tin cup of water, his fingers brushing hers. The simple contact was like a spark, a reminder that they were real, that they had survived. She watched him as he checked the wound on his arm, where a splinter from the exploding bridge had torn his sleeve. It was a shallow gash, but it was bleeding sluggishly. "Let me," she said, her voice husky. She tore a strip from her petticoat and, dipping it in the clean water, began to gently clean the wound. As she worked, her fingers traced the edge of an older scar on his forearm, a puckered, silver line, and below it, on his ribs, she could see the faint, latticed pattern of scars that were far older, faded but still stark against his skin. They were a silent history of a life lived at the sharp end of conflict. "The war," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet statement of fact. Chaska's jaw tightened, but he did not pull away. He looked into the fire, his eyes seeing something far beyond the dancing flames. "The greasy grass," he said, his voice low, using the Lakota name for the little bighorn. "I was young, full of fire. We fought for our land, for our families. We won the battle." His voice turned bitter. "But they sent more soldiers, always more. They took our horses. They took our food. They drove us onto the reservations in the dead of winter." He fell silent, and in that silence, Elise could hear the ghosts of his past, the cries of the dying, the weeping of women, the hollow ache of a victory that led to ultimate defeat. "These," he said, his hand unconsciously touching the old scars on his ribs, "are from a soldier's bayonet, but the one that hurts is the one you cannot see. It is the guilt of the survivor. I lived, while my cousin, my friends, they did not, for a long time. I wondered why the spirits let me walk away when better men fell." His confession was a gift, a piece of his closely guarded soul offered in the firelight. He was not just the silent, capable warrior. He was a man who had lost his world, a man haunted by the faces of the dead. Elise finally understood the source of the profound sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes, and the fierce, protective honor that drove him. He fought for the living because he could no longer fight for the dead. Her own grief, which she had held at bay with anger and a thirst for justice, rose up to meet his. "I know that guilt," she whispered, her hand stilling on his arm. "After Martin died, every morning I woke up was a betrayal. Why me? Why was I allowed to breathe the air when he could not?" She looked at Chaska, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And now, after the bridge, I was so afraid, not just of dying. I was afraid of losing you, and I felt so ashamed, as if feeling that meant I was forgetting him." Chaska turned his gaze from the fire to her. He saw the war in her, the loyalty to a cherished memory, locked in a desperate battle with the needs of a living, beating heart. He reached out and, with a surprising gentleness, took a long, dry stalk of foxtail grass from a bundle near the hearth. His fingers, so strong and capable with a knife or a horse's reins, moved with a delicate, practiced grace as he began to weave the grass into a small, intricate braid. "In my village," he said, his voice soft, his eyes on his work, "when a person's spirit is troubled, we give them a circle, something to hold. It is not a chain. It is just to remind them that they are not alone." When he was finished, he had made a small, simple bracelet of woven grass. He took her hand and gently tied it around her wrist. The touch was light, respectful, but it sent a tremor through her entire being. The bracelet was a tangible link between them, a symbol of their shared survival, a fragile bridge between their two worlds. He did not release her hand. He looked into her eyes, and the universe seemed to shrink to the small, fire-lit space between them. The sounds of the stream and the wolf faded away. There was only the crackle of the fire and the thundering of her own heart. He leaned in, and Elise felt her breath catch, her body swaying toward his. This was not a surrender. It was a recognition. To deny this connection, this powerful, undeniable force that had grown between them in the crucible of shared danger, would be the truest betrayal of all, a betrayal of life itself. He stopped, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm on her cheek. The air between them was electric, charged with all the things they had not said, all the things they had endured. He was giving her a choice, a final moment to turn away. She did not. His voice was a low, resonant whisper, a vow spoken not just with his breath, but with his entire soul. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through her skin, to settle deep in her bones. "Tonight you're my wife and my family in the future," the Lakota promised with his lips on her skin. He sealed the promise not with a kiss of passion, but with a gesture of profound tenderness, his lips gently brushing the sensitive skin of her temple. It was a promise of sanctuary, a promise of belonging, a promise that tomorrow, if they lived to see it, they would not face it alone. And in that moment, the war inside Elise ceased. She was not betraying Martin. She was honoring the life he had given his own to protect. She was choosing to live and to love. Chaska's promise was not a claim, but an anchor. She clung to it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt not the terror of what she had to lose, but the profound, aching beauty of what she had just found. They awoke with the first gray light of dawn, curled together under a shared blanket near the embers of the fire. The intimacy of the night had not vanished with the darkness. It had settled into a quiet, comfortable reality. A new strength flowed between them, a shared resolve. They laid the second ledger on the cabin's rough-hewn table. The papers seemed to glow in the morning light, a repository of truth and hope. "We can't take this to Fort Laramie," Elise said, her voice practical now, clear-headed. "It would take a week. Kellard's men will be hunting us, and by the time we arrived, the dam would be finished and the water gone. We need to get this into the right hands." Chaska agreed, "and we need to stop the work at Split Rock Canyon." A memory surfaced for Elise. "Ada," she said, her thoughts racing. She mentioned someone, a man she trusts. She said he was a federal agent, but working quietly, investigating land fraud claims for the Department of the Interior. She said he didn't trust the local authorities or the BIA agents any more than she did. His name is Special Agent Rowe. The long shot was their only shot. "How do we reach him without leading Keller to Ada?" Chaska asked. "Ada and Hazel will have to get a message to him," Elise reasoned. "But first, we have to give them a reason to believe we're still alive, and a way to do it." She looked at Chaska. "You know these hills. Is there a place—" "A signal." A slow smile touched Chaska's lips for the first time. "There is a place, an old signal point on the high bluffs. From there, you can see the whole valley, and the smoke from a fire can be seen for 50 miles, but it will also show Kellard where we are." "It's a risk we have to take," Elise said, her resolve firming. "We give them the signal. That will tell Ada and Hazel we have the ledger and we're alive. They can get word to Agent Rowe. And while they do that, she looked at him, her eyes bright with a dangerous new idea. We buy them some time. We can't take on Crowell's entire work crew. But we don't have to. We just need to stop them, to slow them down. Chaska's smile widened. He understood. They were no longer just running. They were going to fight back. They would light a fire that would serve as a beacon of hope for their friends, and a challenge to their enemies. And then, under the cover of the chaos they created, they would bring the thunder of the law down on Split Rock Canyon. The smoke from the signal fire was a single, unwavering column of gray against the vast Dakota sky. It was a message of defiance, a promise, and a challenge. From their vantage point on the high bluffs, Chaska and Elise watched it rise, knowing it was a beacon for both their allies and their enemies. Down in Ash Hollow, Ada and Hazel would see it and know they had the ledger. But Sheriff Kellard would see it too. And he would come. The clock was now ticking, its hands measured in hoofbeats and gunpowder. Chaska left Elise in a defensible rock shelter with the ledger, now carefully wrapped and sealed with wax from their meager supplies. They will look for two, he said. Be one. Be a shadow until I return. He moved off into the hills, his destination a hidden encampment where his cousin Winona kept a watch over the white man's encroachments. Winona was a woman whose spirit was as sharp and unyielding as the flint she used for her arrowheads. She listened to Chaska's story, her dark eyes missing nothing, her expression a mask of cold fury as he described the map of their ancestors' graves. When he finished, she simply nodded. She gathered a half-dozen of her best hunters, men who could move through the canyons like water, their faces grim. They were not fighting for a white woman's justice. They were fighting for the sanctity of their dead and the future of their living. The plan was set. They would be the ghosts on the ridge. Meanwhile, in Ash Hollow, Ada Bellamy saw the smoke signal and moved with a physician's calculated urgency. She sent a coded message through a trusted stagecoach driver to the next way station, addressed to a Mr. Rowe, informing him that a package of great legal import would be awaiting him at the temporary postal tent near the Split Rock work site in 2 days' time. Then, she and Hazel loaded Ada's buggy not with medical supplies, but with blankets, canteens, and a quiet, desperate courage. They were the second front in a war that would be won or lost by nightfall. Split Rock Canyon was a raw, ugly wound carved into the earth. By day, it was a hell of noise and dust. By night, a skeletal landscape of dark machinery and looming timber scaffolding, lit by the scattered, lonely glare of lanterns. The air hissed with the sound of a massive steam pump that kept the main cofferdam from flooding. Guards, hired guns from Colorado with cold eyes and ready rifles, patrolled the perimeter. They were not miners. They were soldiers in a private army. Chaska and Elise met at the canyon's edge as dusk bled into a starless night. He had brought her a set of buckskin trousers and a dark shirt. In the rough clothes, she was just another shadow in a world of them. Winona is in position, he said, his voice a low rumble. They will make their move when they see our signal. He pointed to the heart of the construction site. The main sluice gate is there. It controls the flow of the river around the main dam. But beside it is a smaller, secondary channel they use to drain excess water. It's built of wood. We break that, and the river will turn back on itself. It will flood the work site, swamp the pump, and buy us the time we need. He handed her a small, tightly wrapped bundle of oilcloth. It was a carefully measured charge of dynamite, stolen from a prospector's abandoned cache, with a short fuse. This is our thunder, he said. Their infiltration was a masterpiece of stealth. Chaska led them down a treacherous goat path, moving with a silence that seemed to bend the darkness around them. They slipped past a pair of guards who were sharing a bottle and complaining about the cold, their voices swallowed by the hiss of the steam engine. They reached the diversion channel. It was a massive wooden trough, 10 feet wide, held together with iron bands. A torrent of dark, powerful water surged through it. To destroy it would be to unleash a localized flood. From a ridge high above, a single, piercing bird call echoed through the canyon, Winona's signal. Almost immediately, chaos erupted on the opposite rim. Shouts, the twang of bowstrings, and the terrifying shriek of a Lakota war cry. Lanterns bobbed wildly as a group of guards was drawn away, charging up the scree slope to fight enemies who were not there, phantoms who loosed a few arrows into the dirt and then vanished. At the same moment, on the main access road, Ada Bellamy's buggy clattered to a halt. Hazel leaped out, screaming that there had been a terrible accident, a boiler explosion at a nearby homestead, and that men were dying. The ruse, sold by Hazel's genuine panic and Ada's grim authority, was perfect. It drew the site's medic and, more importantly, the man who operated the telegraph, cutting the site off from any outside communication. This was their chance. Chaska and Elise moved to the base of the wooden sluice. As Chaska wedged the charge against a key support joint, Elise stood watch. The ground vibrated with the rhythm of the steam pump, a monstrous, iron heartbeat. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, cold and sharp. "Don't move!" Sheriff Kellard stepped out from behind a stack of cut timbers, his pistol leveled, and beside him, his face ashen, was Deputy Jonah Pike. "I knew you didn't have the stomach to run. Hartman," Kellard sneered, his eyes glittering. "Had a feeling you'd try something stupid and heroic." He gestured with his gun toward Jonah. "My boy here has been very helpful. He told me all about your little meetings, your plans. He knew you were coming for the bridge, and he knew you'd end up here." Elise stared at Jonah, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The betrayal was so complete, so profound. It stole the air from her lungs. Jonah wouldn't meet her eyes. "Light it!" "Elise," Chaska said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't take his eyes off Kellard. "Don't be a fool, Indian," Kellard laughed. "You'll kill us all." "The water will stop you before the blast does," Chaska countered. "Light it." With a trembling hand, Elise struck a match. Its tiny flare seemed impossibly bright. She touched it to the fuse. It sputtered, caught, and began to hiss. A tiny, deadly snake of fire. Kellard's face contorted with rage. He saw the source of all his problems, the woman who had brought this chaos down upon him. He swung his pistol toward Elise. "This ends now," he snarled. It was in that instant that Jonah Pike finally moved. His loyalty, his fear, his soul had been stretched to the breaking point, and now it snapped. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't shout a warning. He simply acted. He threw himself in front of Elise, a desperate, clumsy shield of flesh and bone. Kellard's pistol bucked in his hand. The shot was deafeningly loud. Jonah cried out, a sharp, choked sound, and stumbled backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed at Elise's feet, his eyes wide with shock and a strange, sudden clarity. He looked up at her, his lips struggling to form words. "The truth," he gasped, his hand clutching at her sleeve. "Bring it, to the light." Then the light in his own eyes went out. The world dissolved into chaos. The charge detonated with a bone-jarring asterisk, crump asterisk. The wooden sluice wall splintered, then burst outward in an explosion of timber and water. A 10-foot wall of black, churning river water surged into the work site, a liquid battering ram. It slammed into the steam pump, which choked, sputtered, and died with a final, agonized hiss. Chaska tackled Kellard, driving him away from Elise and into the rising, muddy torrent. The two men went down, grappling in the knee-deep, freezing water. Their pistols were lost, useless. It became a primal, brutal fight on a ledge of wet, slippery rock. Kellard was bigger, stronger, fueled by a simple, brutish rage. Chaska was faster, a whirlwind of precise, desperate strikes. He fought not just for his life, but for the future he had promised Elise, for the memory of the boy now lying dead in the mud. As they fought, the secondary explosion triggered a far greater disaster. High above, the main dynamite charge, shaken by the blast, caused a section of the canyon wall to shear away. A river of rock and earth cascaded down, right toward the main explosives shed. The worksite dissolved into pure panic. Men screamed and ran, scrambling for the only way out, a narrow, temporary rope and plank suspension bridge that crossed the main chasm. On the ledge, Chaska gained the upper hand. He dodged a wild swing from Kellard and the sheriff, his boots finding no purchase on the slick, muddy stone, overbalanced. He slipped, his arms windmilling, and fell into the deepest part of the flood channel. The current caught him, sweeping him away, his curses swallowed by the roar of the water. Chaska didn't watch him go. He turned and plunged back through the rising water to Elise, who was kneeling, frozen, beside Jonah's body. "Elise, we have to go now," he yelled, hauling her to her feet. The ground shook as the rock slide hit the explosives shed. The resulting detonation was apocalyptic. A blinding flash of white light turned night into day, followed by a wave of pure concussive force that threw them from their feet. The main cofferdam, the product of months of labor and tons of steel and timber, simply vanished. The river, freed from its bonds, roared into the canyon, reclaiming its rightful course with a terrifying, cleansing fury. The suspension bridge was tearing loose from its moorings. It was their only escape. They joined the frantic scramble of terrified workers, running across the wildly swaying planks. Halfway across, a support rope snapped. The bridge lurched violently, dropping 10 feet. Elise lost her footing. She cried out as she slipped, her hands scrabbling at the rough wood before she fell. Managing to grab hold of a trailing rope at the last second, she dangled over the abyss, the raging river 100 feet below. It was Raven's Gorge all over again. The same terror, the same impossible height, but everything was different. Chaska, already on the relatively stable far side, turned without hesitation. He lay flat on the edge of the cliff, the bridge collapsing behind him, and stretched out his hand. His eyes locked onto hers, and in them, she saw no fear, only an unshakable certainty. "Elise, take my hand." His voice cut through her panic. This time, it was not the hand of a stranger, a warrior saving a life out of abstract honor. It was the hand of her family, her future. She reached up, her fingers straining, and locked her hand in his. His grip was like iron, with a strength that seemed impossible. He pulled, hand over hand, drawing her up from the edge of death, back onto the solid ground of the living world. They collapsed together, safe, as the last of the bridge tore away and plunged into the canyon. They had survived, dazed and deafened. They made their way to the prearranged meeting point, the now abandoned postal tent on the main access road. A man stood waiting by a wagon, a lit cigarillo glowing in the pre-dawn light. He was of medium height, dressed in unassuming traveler's clothes, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "Mrs. Hartman?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "I'm Agent Rowe. Doctor, Bellamy sent word you had something for me." Elise, her clothes torn, her face smudged with dirt and grief, reached inside her shirt and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. She handed it to him. The weight of it, the burden of it, finally lifted from her shoulders. Agent Rowe took the ledger, his expression grim as he looked back at the smoke and ruin that had once been Split Rock Canyon. "It would seem," he said, his voice dry, "that you've saved the government a great deal of time and expense." The world after the explosion was unnervingly silent. The roar of the river had returned to its natural, steady voice, a sound the valley had not heard in months. The hiss of the steam pump was gone. The shouts of men were gone. In their place was the gentle whisper of the wind moving through the pines and the distant, mournful creak of ruined machinery. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gray, a peaceful, indifferent witness to the night's violence. Agent Rowe did not move with the frantic energy of a local sheriff. His authority was quiet, absolute. He listened intently as Elise, her voice hoarse and trembling, recounted the entire story, from the chase on the plains to Jonah Pike's last desperate act of redemption. Chaska stood beside her, a silent corroborator, his presence a testament to the truth of her words. Rowe examined the ledger, his sharp eyes taking in the forged survey, the map of the burial sites, and Martin Hartman's damning, heartfelt notes. "I've been investigating Crowell's land acquisitions for 6 months," Rowe said, his voice flat and devoid of surprise. "I had a dozen threads of smoke, but you, Mrs. Hartman, you've just handed me the fire." He dispatched one of his 2 men plainclothed deputies who had arrived with him to ride hard for the nearest federal marshal's office with a full report and a request for reinforcements. Then, he turned his attention to the immediate aftermath. Their return to Ash Hollow was not as fugitives. They rode in Rowe's wagon, a federal agent sitting beside them, the authority of the United States government a tangible shield around them. The townspeople who had jeered at Chaska and pitied Elise just a day before now stared in stunned silence. The power dynamic of the town had been shattered in a single night, and the pieces were still falling. Their first stop was Ada Bellamy's surgery. The relief on the doctor's face when she saw them alive was profound, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sorrow when Elise told her about Jonah. Ada simply closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. "That poor, foolish boy," she whispered. "He tried to serve 2 masters, and in the end, the devil claimed his due." Hazel was there, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear and steady. The 4 of them, Elise, Chaska, Ada, and Hazel, formed a small, tight circle in the surgery, the survivors of a war the rest of the town was only just beginning to understand. Rowe's first official act was to deputize Chaska, a move that sent a shockwave through the community. The warrant for his arrest was torn from the board outside the sheriff's office and publicly burned. Then, the search for the town's officials began. They found Sheriff Keller 2 miles downstream, washed up on a sandbar, alive but barely. He was a pathetic sight, stripped of his gun, his badge, and his authority, covered in mud and shivering with cold. The brutish power he had wielded was gone, leaving only a hollow, defeated man. Rowe arrested him not for murder or conspiracy that would come later, but for the simple, irrefutable crime of obstructing a federal investigation. As he was led in chains to the town's small jail, the silence of the onlookers was his true judgment. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Silas Crowell, but Crowell was gone. His house was empty, his office at the mining company in disarray. For a day, a nervous tension gripped the town. He was a snake who had been cornered, and no one knew where he might strike. The answer came from the source of his power, the North Star silver mine. A deputy sent to search the premises found the main gate unlocked and the place eerily silent. A single ore cart stood at the top of the main incline, its brake lever disengaged. Further down the tracks, where the rails had been slowly decaying from years of neglect and cost-cutting, a section had given way. At the bottom of the shaft lay the wreckage of another cart, and beneath it, the body of Silas Crowell. In his desperate flight, he had put his faith in the machinery he had so proudly built, and it had failed him. His death was not the result of a dramatic shootout or a final confrontation, but a quiet, ignominious accident. It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had built an empire on rotten foundations. With the twin tyrants of the town removed, the fear that had held Ash Hollow in its grip for years finally broke. The truth, like the newly freed river, began to flow. People started to talk. The German farmers, led by the Muller family, came forward, their signed affidavits now bolstered by a newfound courage. Miners spoke of the unsafe conditions, of the green timbers in the collapsed shaft. Small business owners told stories of extortion and intimidation. The Sunday following the explosion, the town gathered not in the church, but in the open square. It was a meeting without a formal leader, a spontaneous assembly of people needing to make sense of the wreckage of their community. It was here that Ada Bellamy, her voice clear and strong, made her public confession. She told them everything about the false coroner's report, about patching up Crowell's thugs in the dead of night, about the compromises she had made out of a desperate desire to continue serving them. "I told myself I was doing it for you," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, meeting the gazes of the people she had delivered, mended, and comforted for 30 years. "But that was a lie I told myself to sleep at night. The truth is, I was afraid, and my fear made me complicit. For that, I am truly sorry." There was no condemnation. There was only a quiet, understanding sympathy. Her confession was not seen as a weakness, but as a final act of courage. In that moment, she was not just their doctor. She was one of them, a fellow victim who had found the strength to speak the truth. She was forgiven. In the days that followed, the town began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding itself. Not with timber and stone, but with trust. Agent Rowe, with the backing of Judge Morrison, formally dissolved the corrupt town council. He appointed Hazel Price as the new registrar for the land office, tasking her with reviewing every single claim filed under Crowell's reign. Her small schoolhouse became a center of quiet, meticulous justice, its windows bright with lamplight late into the night as she worked to untangle the web of lies. The most profound healing, however, took place not in an office, but around a fire. Chaska, with Winona at his side, invited the townspeople to a council fire on the banks of the now peaceful Willow Creek. Many were hesitant, their ingrained prejudices dying hard. But the Muller family came, and a few others followed. In the flickering light of the flames, Mr. Muller stood, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a deep, honest shame. He spoke in broken English, with Hazel translating his German for the Lakota, and Chaska translating the meaning for the settlers. "We were wrong," Muller said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were afraid of losing the little we had. Crowell, he used that fear. He told us you were the enemy. We chose to believe him because it was easier than believing a rich man could be a liar." He looked directly at Winona and Chaska. "We ask for your forgiveness." Winona accepted his apology with a solemn, dignified nod. The fire crackled, the only sound for a long moment. It was not a magical absolution, but it was a start. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a new, more honest community. Amid the work of rebuilding, the town did not forget its debts to the dead. A simple wooden grave marker was erected in the small cemetery on the hill. Beside the church, Hazel, with her beautiful, precise handwriting, carved the inscription herself. Asterisk Jonah Pike. He lost his way, but found his soul. Bring it to the light. Asterisk. Elise and Chaska often walked to the grave in the quiet of the evening. They stood not in judgment, but in a shared, sorrowful understanding of the boy who had been crushed between two worlds. Their own future, forged in violence and sealed with a promise, now needed its own foundation. They honored it in two ways, bridging the worlds they had brought together. First, there was a Lakota ceremony, as private and sacred as the promise that had preceded it, with only Winona and a few of Chaska's kin as witnesses. They stood by the creek. There were no rings, no formal pronouncements. There was the smoke of sweetgrass, a blessing spoken in the old tongue, and the quiet exchange of vows that were not about possession, but about a shared path. Elise, wearing the simple deerskin dress Winona had made for her, felt a sense of belonging more profound than any she had ever known. A week later, they stood before the town in the small wooden church. The pews were filled, but not in the usual way. The Mueller family sat beside Winona. Miners in their Sunday best shared a bench with Lakota hunters. Ada Bellamy stood as Elise's witness, her face serene. The ceremony was simple, the words of the preacher familiar, but the gathering was revolutionary. It was the physical embodiment of the new Ash Hollow, when Chaska, in his own quiet, resonant voice, and Elise, her voice clear and full of a joy she never thought she would feel again, spoke their vows. They were making a promise not just to each other, but to the entire watching community. They were the bridge. The fall that year was mild. The river, flowing strong and clean, settled into its new, deeper channel, with the federal government having nullified all of Crowell's claims. The land was secure, but the town needed a new way to measure their shared lifeblood, a way that was honest and transparent. They decided to build a new water marker at the edge of town, a thick post of solid oak driven deep into the riverbank. It was marked with lines for the seasons, a community gauge to ensure that no one could ever again secretly steal the water that belonged to everyone. The day it was finished, Hazel brought the children down from the schoolhouse. She gave them pots of paint bright blues, reds, and yellows, the children of the German farmers, the miners' sons and daughters, and the Lakota children who had begun to cautiously attend her lessons, all gathered around the post, together, laughing and chattering in a jumble of languages. They decorated it. They painted fish and birds, suns and moons, and a winding blue line that represented the river. They painted it not as a legal instrument, but as a totem, a shared piece of art. Elise and Chaska stood back, watching, his hand resting lightly on her back. They saw a small Lakota girl show a blond German boy how to mix colors to make green. They saw the children's hands, smudged with every color of the rainbow, reaching across the old divides. The marker was no longer just a measure of water. It was a monument to a future they had all fought for, a promise being painted in bright, hopeful colors by the hands of their children. 4 autumns had passed, each one gentler than the last. The Dakota Territory still knew hardship, but in the valley surrounding Ash Hollow, the land and its people had learned to breathe again. The scar of Split Rock Canyon was softening, its raw edges now fringed with willow and new grass. The river, the town's true heart, ran clear and steady, its voice a constant, soothing murmur. This autumn was particularly mild. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and curing hay. Cottonwood seeds, like flurries of late-season snow, drifted on the breeze, catching in the hair of the children who now played together in the expanded schoolyard. The one-room schoolhouse Hazel Price had so fiercely defended was now a 2-room schoolhouse, a new wing built with lumber donated by the Muller family and labor from miners and Lakota men alike. Inside, the Lakota language was taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right alongside English grammar and arithmetic. The sound of children's laughter, a mix of German, Lakota, and English accents, was the new, true music of the town. Down by the creek, another kind of construction was underway. A new wooden bridge was being raised, a sturdy, honest structure designed to connect the town to the homesteads on the other side. Its architect and lead builder was Chaska. He was no longer a warrior living between worlds, a ghost on the edge of town. He was a creator, a man who now built connections with his hands. He moved with a quiet, focused contentment, his hammer blows ringing true and steady. He had found a new kind of peace, not in the absence of conflict, but in the deliberate, tangible act of building something that would last. Elise watched him from the porch of the small, sturdy cabin he had built for them. A cabin that sat on a piece of land that was neither reservation nor town plot, but simply theirs. In her arms, a small bundle shifted and cooed. Their daughter, just over a year old, had Elise's bright, intelligent eyes and Chaska's serene spirit. They had named her Aglai, the Lakota word for hope. She was the living embodiment of their promise, a child of 2 worlds who would, they prayed, inherit the best of both. Hope was a citizen of the new Ash Hollow. She was rocked to sleep with Lakota lullabies and German folk songs. Dr. Ada Bellamy, now comfortably past 70 but with a spirit as sharp as her scalpels, was her doting honorary grandmother. Hazel Price, her school thriving, was her designated teacher, already setting aside picture books for when she was old enough. This was the community that had risen from the ashes of Crowell's greed, a community held together not by fear, but by the tough, resilient sinews of shared experience and hard-won trust. The justice that had seemed so impossible was now a simple, mundane fact of life. In the new town hall, the building that had once been the Hartman and Crowell Mining Acquisitions Office, the county registrar had established a permanent archive. Behind a pane of glass in a heavy oak cabinet built by a local carpenter lay 2 cowhide ledgers. They were no longer secret weapons or death warrants. They were artifacts, a public lesson in the town's own history, open for any citizen to see. Martin Hartman's true survey lay beside the forgery, his integrity finally, and permanently, vindicated. The map to the Lakota burial sites had been returned to Winona in a solemn ceremony, its sacred trust honored. The law had done its part, but it was the people who had truly created the peace. Justice, Elise had learned, was not a prize won at the end of a fight. It was a garden that had to be tended every single day. It required the law, yes, but it also required the community's constant vigilance, its commitment to honesty, its willingness to listen. It required people like the Mullers, who now shared their harvest with their Lakota neighbors, and people like Winona, who taught the settler children which wild berries were safe to eat. Chaska's bridge was the perfect symbol of this new reality. He was not building it alone. He worked with miners who had learned from him how to read the grain of the wood, how to place a support beam to withstand the spring floods. They worked not as a crew of hired men, but as neighbors. They were building more than a crossing over a creek. They were finishing the work they had all started 4 years ago. They were building a bridge of people, one founded on mutual respect and the shared desire for a peaceful future. One evening, as the autumn sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Elise took Hope down to the creek. The day's work was done. The sounds of hammers and saws had been replaced by the gentle chirp of crickets. Chaska was sitting on a newly laid plank of the bridge, his silhouette dark against the vibrant sky. He was looking at the water, at the way it flowed unimpeded toward the plains. He looked up as she approached, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. It was a smile she saw often now, a smile of deep, quiet contentment that reached all the way to his eyes. She sat beside him, shifting Hope in her arms. The baby reached out a tiny hand and grabbed one of Chaska's fingers, her grip surprisingly strong. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the colors of the sky deepen into the soft blue of twilight. There was no need for words. Everything that mattered was here: the peaceful river, the sturdy bridge, the child in her arms, the man by her side. Love, she had come to understand, was not the breathless, desperate thing she had felt in the hunter's cabin, born of fear and adrenaline. That had been the spark, the kindling. This was the fire itself, a steady, warming flame that had to be tended, fed, and protected. It was a choice they made every morning when they woke, and every evening when they lay down to rest. It was in the meals she cooked, in the wood he chopped, in the shared smiles over their daughter's sleepy head. It was a quiet, daily recommitment, more powerful than any single, passionate declaration. Later that night, the cabin was still and quiet. A cool breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, sweet smell of coming rain. Hope was asleep in her cradle, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. Elise stood by the window, looking out at the star-dusted sky. Chaska came up behind her, his arms circling her waist, pulling her back against the warmth of his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own gaze following hers to the heavens. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who had found their anchor in a world that had tried to tear them apart. He lowered his head, his breath warm against her ear, his lips brushing the side of her hair. His voice was a low, gentle murmur, not a passionate promise made in the face of death, but a quiet, simple prayer spoken in the sacred peace of their life together. It was the same promise, but its meaning had deepened, weathered, and grown strong, like the oak of the bridge he was building. It was no longer a hope for the future. It was the truth of their present. "Tonight you're my wife," he whispered, "and my family in the future." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.